Miss Marple and the Murder on a Stormy Night. Chapter 1. The Evening at Greenways. The rain had been threatening all afternoon, dark clouds gathering over the village of St. Mary Mead like an omen no one wished to acknowledge. By 7:30, the first drops began to fall, pattering against the windows of Greenways, the handsome Georgian house that stood at the edge of the village green. Inside, oblivious to the gathering storm, 12 dinner guests chatted amiably in the drawing room, their voices rising and falling in that peculiar rhythm of English social conversation, polite, measured, and entirely superficial. Miss Jane Marple sat in a chintz-covered armchair near the fireplace, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked on what appeared to be a pale blue baby's booty. Her white hair was neatly arranged, her expression mild and attentive, and to the casual observer she might have seemed the very picture of an elderly spinster absorbed in her handiwork. But her sharp blue eyes, bright as a robin's, moved constantly from face to face, observing everything with the acute attention of a naturalist studying specimens in their native habitat. The dinner party had been arranged by Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, who had recently returned from 3 years in India, and were eager to re-establish their place in village society. Mrs. Bantry, Dolly to her friends, was a comfortable, well-meaning woman with a tendency toward enthusiastic chatter. The Colonel, by contrast, was a man of few words, most of them related to matters military or meteorological. "The glass has been falling all day," he observed to no one in particular, peering through the window at the darkening sky. "We're in for a proper blow, mark my words." "Oh, Arthur, do stop worrying about the weather," his wife said with affectionate exasperation. "Our guests are all safely here, and no one need venture out until morning. It will be quite cosy, like a house party." Indeed, the Bantrys had planned the evening with considerable care. In addition to Miss Marple, the guests included Dr. Haydock, the village physician, a shrewd man with a brusque manner that concealed genuine kindness, the vicar, Reverend Clement, and his much younger wife, Griselda, whose modern attitudes occasionally scandalized the parish, Sir Edmund Harrow, a distinguished architect in his 60s, who had recently purchased the old Finch property, his daughter Vanessa, a striking woman of 30 with dark hair and an air of barely suppressed impatience, Mr. Raymond West, Miss Marple's nephew, a successful novelist of the modern school, accompanied by his wife Joyce, and finally the evening's guest of honour, Cedric Fortescue, a celebrated actor who had retired to the countryside after a glittering career on the London stage. It was Fortescue who dominated the conversation, as he had no doubt dominated countless drawing rooms before. He was a handsome man despite his 60-odd years, with silver hair worn rather longer than was fashionable, expressive hands, and a voice that could fill a theatre without apparent effort. "The modern stage has lost something essential," he was saying, gesturing with his wineglass. "It's all naturalism now, mumbling and slouching about. In my day, we understood that theatre was theatre, not a pale imitation of life." "But surely," ventured Raymond West, "art should reflect contemporary existence. We no longer live in the age of melodrama." "My dear boy," Fortescue replied with an indulgent smile, "human nature doesn't change, regardless of what age we live in. The great passions, love, jealousy, ambition, revenge, these are eternal. Only the costumes are different." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. She had been observing the interplay between Fortescue and Vanessa Harrow with considerable interest. The young woman had positioned herself on the sofa directly opposite the actor, and while she appeared to be listening with polite attention, there was something in her expression, a tightness around the mouth perhaps, or an unusual intensity in her gaze that suggested a more complex emotional state. "I saw you in the second Mrs. Tanqueray at the Haymarket," Vanessa said suddenly. "It must have been 15 years ago. I was just a girl, but I've never forgotten it." A curious expression crossed Fortescue's face. Surprise, perhaps, or was it something else? "How very kind of you to remember," he said smoothly. "That was one of my favourite roles." Sir Edmund, who had been discussing ecclesiastical architecture with the vicar, turned at the mention of his daughter. "Vanessa was mad for the theatre at one time," he said with a fond smile. "Wanted to go on the stage herself. I'm afraid I put my foot down rather firmly." "Quite right, too," said Colonel Bantry. "No life for a respectable girl." Vanessa's face flushed, and she looked down at her hands, which were clenched tightly in her lap. Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Bantry threw her an anxious glance before quickly suggesting they should go in to dinner. The dining room at Greenways was a handsome apartment with dark panelling and portraits of 18th century Bantrys gazing down from the walls. The storm had arrived in earnest now, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling in the chimneys. The butler, an elderly man named Parsons, who moved with the careful dignity of his profession, supervised the serving of the meal with the assistance of a young housemaid whose nervousness was apparent in the way her hands trembled as she presented each dish. The conversation continued its meandering, coursed through soup and fish, touching on village affairs, London gossip, and the likelihood of a general election. Miss Marple contributed little, merely nodding and smiling in the right places, but her attention never wavered. She had noticed, for instance, that Dr. Haydock had become unusually quiet, his jovial manner replaced by a preoccupied frown. She had also observed that Griselda Clement, usually so animated, seemed subdued, and that the young vicar's wife kept glancing towards Cedric Fortescue with an expression that might have been recognition, or perhaps apprehension. It was during the entrée, an excellent saddle of mutton, that the evening took its first uncomfortable turn. Raymond West, with the confidence of one accustomed to literary controversy, had begun to expound his views on modern morality. "We must move beyond Victorian hypocrisy," he declared. "Forgiveness, understanding, acceptance of human frailty. These should be our watchwords, not rigid judgment and social ostracism." "Easy enough to say," observed Dr. Haydock dryly, "when one hasn't been personally injured. But my dear doctor, that's precisely my point. We all make mistakes, all fall short of some impossible ideal. The question is whether we allow people to redeem themselves, or condemn them forever for a single transgression." Cedric Fortescue set down his wine-glass with rather more force than necessary. "Some transgressions," he said in a voice that had lost its theatrical warmth, "deserve permanent consequences." An awkward silence fell over the table. Mrs. Bantry, ever the hostess, rushed to fill it with bright chatter about the village flower show. But Miss Marple had seen the look that passed between Fortescue and Dr. Haydock, a look of mutual understanding, and something that might have been shared bitterness. The storm reached its height as coffee was being served in the drawing-room. Thunder rolled overhead, and the lights flickered ominously. Mrs. Bantry rang for Parsons, who assured her that candles and oil lamps had been prepared in case of a power failure. It was then, as lightning illuminated the room in a harsh white glare, that Miss Marple saw him, a face at the window, pale and desperate, pressed against the streaming glass. The impression lasted only a moment before darkness returned, but in that instant she had registered every detail. a young man no more than 30, with dark hair plastered to his skull by rain, and an expression of terror that struck her as wholly genuine. "Good heavens!" exclaimed the colonel. "There's someone outside!" Before anyone could respond, there came a violent hammering at the front door. Chapter 2. The uninvited guest Parsons moved with remarkable speed for a man of his years, crossing the hall with Colonel Bantry close behind him. The rest of the party crowded into the doorway of the drawing-room, peering anxiously into the dimly lit passage. Miss Marple remained in her chair, but her knitting had been set aside, and her attention was entirely focused on the scene unfolding before her. The butler drew back the heavy bolts and opened the door. A gust of wind and rain swept into the hall, and with it stumbled a young man in a state of complete dishevelment. His clothes were soaked through, his face streaked with mud and what might have been blood, and he gasped for breath as though he had been running for miles. "Help me," he managed to say. "Please, you must help me. He's going to kill me." "Good God, man, come in," said the colonel, taking the stranger's arm and pulling him inside. Parsons closed the door against the storm and stood regarding the dripping figure with an expression of profound disapproval. "Who's going to kill you?" demanded the colonel. "What's happened?" The young man's wild eyes swept the assembled company, and suddenly they fixed on someone in the group. His face, already pale, went absolutely white. "You," he whispered. "What are you doing here?" Miss Marple followed his gaze. He was staring directly at Cedric Fortescue, who had gone rigid, his theatrical composure entirely abandoned. "I don't know this person," Fortescue said quickly. "I've never seen him before in my life. Liar!" The young man lunged forward, but Dr. Haydock and Raymond West caught him, holding him back. "You know exactly who I am. You destroyed my mother, and now you want me dead too." "The man is clearly deranged," Fortescue said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Dolly, perhaps you should telephone the police," suggested Sir Edmund quietly. "No," the young man struggled in his captor's grip. "You don't understand. There's a murderer out there. He followed me here from London. He tried to run me off the road, and when I crashed my car in the lane, he came after me on foot. I barely escaped." Dr. Haydock, ever practical, placed a hand on the young man's forehead. "He's burning with fever. Raymond, help me get him to the sofa. Mrs. Bantry, hot water and towels, if you please. We'll sort out this mystery after we've attended to his immediate needs." They manoeuvred the stranger into the drawing-room and deposited him on the sofa. Griselda Clement hurried to fetch a blanket, while Mrs. Bantry bustled off in search of the requested supplies. The young man's eyes were beginning to glaze with fever, but he clutched at Dr. Haydock's sleeve. "You have to believe me," he said urgently. "My name is Michael Ashton. My mother was Eleanor Ashton, Eleanor Fortescue, before she married my father. She died 6 months ago, and before she died, she told me the truth about everything. About him," he pointed a shaking finger at Cedric Fortescue. "About how he abandoned her when she was pregnant with his child. How he paid her to disappear and never speak his name again. How he destroyed her life." A collective gasp went up from the assembled guests. Fortescue's face had turned a mottled red. "This is outrageous. The ravings of a madman, is it?" Michael Ashton's voice was growing weaker. "Is that why you hired someone to kill me? Because I wrote to you 3 weeks ago, threatening to expose you to the newspapers? Your glittering reputation, your carefully constructed image, all of it built on lies and the ruin of a young woman who loved you." "Preposterous," Fortescue said, but he had taken a step backward, and Miss Marple noticed that his hands were trembling. "Mr. Fortescue," she said gently, and everyone turned to look at her in surprise. She had been so quiet they had almost forgotten her presence. Perhaps you would care to explain the situation. It seems you do know this young man after all. Fortescue's theatrical training reasserted itself. He drew himself up, his expression a masterpiece of wounded dignity. Very well. Yes, I knew his mother many years ago. It was a brief affair, nothing more. When she informed me she was pregnant, I did the honourable thing. I provided for her financially. She chose to marry another man and raise the child as his. I have had no contact with her in over 30 years. The honourable thing, Michael repeated bitterly. You paid her to go away and never trouble you again. You threatened that if she ever spoke of your relationship, you would ensure she never worked in theatre again, that she would be ruined socially. She was 19 years old, pregnant and terrified, and you cast her aside like rubbish. That's enough, said Dr. Haydock firmly. Whatever the truth of this matter, it can wait. This man needs rest and medical attention. The fever may well be affecting his judgment. But what about this alleged pursuer? Asked the vicar. Should we not search the grounds? Colonel Bantry nodded grimly. Quite right. Parsons, bring my shotgun. Raymond, Sir Edmund, will you join me? We'll have a look round the property. I'll come too, said Fortescue, but the colonel shook his head. I think you'd better remain here, Fortescue, under the circumstances. The three men departed, leaving the drawing-room in a state of uncomfortable tension. Michael Ashton had lapsed into semi-consciousness, muttering feverishly. Dr. Haydock examined him with professional thoroughness, noting a nasty gash on the side of his head and several cuts and bruises consistent with having been in a car accident. Miss Marple observed Vanessa Harrow, who stood by the window staring out into the storm. The young woman's face was perfectly composed, but her fingers gripped the curtain so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. When she became aware of Miss Marple's gaze, she let the curtain fall and moved away. How perfectly dreadful, murmured Joyce West. Do you suppose he's telling the truth? About the affair, or about the murderer? Asked Griselda Clement with characteristic directness. Both, I suppose. Well, said Griselda, lowering her voice, I did hear something once, years ago when I was in London, about Cedric Fortescue and a young actress who disappeared rather suddenly from a production. There was talk, you know, the sort of whispers that circulate in theatrical circles, but I never knew any details. Mrs. Bantry returned with hot water and towels, and Dr. Haydock set about cleaning and bandaging Michael Ashton's head wound. The young man stirred, opening his eyes briefly. Eleanor, he whispered. I'm sorry, Mother. I tried. Then his eyes closed again, and he fell into what appeared to be a natural sleep. The search party returned 20 minutes later, drenched and empty-handed. Not a soul out there, reported the colonel. We went all the way down to the lane, found his car, right enough, smashed into the hedgerow about half a mile from here. No sign of anyone else, though. Perhaps he imagined it, suggested Sir Edmund. The fever, the shock of the accident. Or perhaps, said Miss Marple quietly, the person he fears is not outside the house at all. Everyone turned to stare at her. She smiled apologetically. I'm sorry, I shouldn't speculate. It's just that the poor young man seemed so very certain. And he did look directly at someone when he arrived, though whether it was Mr. Fortescue specifically or someone else in the group, I couldn't quite say from where I was sitting. What are you suggesting? Demanded Fortescue angrily. Why, nothing at all, Mr. Fortescue. Merely thinking aloud. Such a dreadful habit at my age. Now, I wonder if someone might help me to my room. I find I'm rather tired after all this excitement. Raymond moved to assist his aunt, but she waved him away. No, no, dear boy. Stay and help Dr. Haydock with the poor young man. I'm sure Vanessa won't mind seeing me upstairs. Will you, my dear? Vanessa Harrow looked startled but quickly recovered. "Of course not, Miss Marple. I'd be happy to." As they mounted the stairs together, Miss Marple chatted pleasantly about nothing in particular, but her keen eyes noted the tension in the young woman's posture, the way she kept glancing back down toward the drawing room. "Such a terrible shock for all of us," Miss Marple said, "especially for those who knew Mr. Fortescue well. Had you met him before this evening, my dear?" Vanessa's step faltered slightly. "No, that is only that once, when I saw him perform. I told you about that. Ah, yes, so you did. 15 years ago, you said. You would have been quite young. 15, actually. And yet you remembered the performance so vividly. He must have made quite an impression." They had reached Miss Marple's room. Vanessa opened the door and stood back to let her pass. "He did," she said quietly. "The kind of impression that lasts a lifetime. Good night, Miss Marple." "Good night, my dear." Miss Marple closed the door and stood for a moment, listening to Vanessa's footsteps retreating down the corridor. Then she crossed to the window and looked out at the storm-lashed darkness. Her reflection in the glass showed a mild, elderly face, but her eyes were sharp and troubled. "Oh dear," she murmured to herself. "Oh dear me, this is going to be very unpleasant indeed." Chapter 3. Morning Revelations. The storm had blown itself out by morning, leaving the world washed clean and bright. Miss Marple woke early, as was her habit, and lay for a few moments listening to the sounds of the house stirring to life below. She had slept poorly, her mind turning over the events of the previous evening, examining them from every angle, as a jeweller might examine a stone for flaws. When she descended to the breakfast room at 8 o'clock, she found several of the other guests already assembled. The atmosphere was subdued, quite unlike the cheerful chatter of the previous evening. Dr. Haydock sat nursing a cup of strong coffee, looking as though he had not slept at all. The vicar and Griselda were speaking in low tones over their kippers. Raymond and Joyce occupied the window seat, their plates untouched before them. "Good morning," Miss Marple said brightly. "What a lovely day after such dreadful weather. How is our unexpected guest this morning, Dr. Haydock?" The doctor looked up wearily. Still sleeping. The fever broke around dawn. "He should recover well enough, physically at least. I've telephoned the police in Much Benham. Inspector Slack is coming over this morning to take statements." "Inspector Slack," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. She had encountered the inspector on previous occasions, and found him to be a man of decided opinions but limited imagination. How very thorough. "And Mr. Fortescue. I trust he passed a comfortable night?" "Mr. Fortescue," said Raymond with barely concealed distaste, "has locked himself in his room and refuses to speak to anyone. I went up this morning to see if he wanted breakfast, but he told me in no uncertain terms to go away." "The poor man must be terribly distressed," observed Mrs. Bantry, entering with a fresh pot of tea. "Whatever the truth of the matter, it's a shocking accusation to have made publicly, and the business about a murderer. Well, one hardly knows what to think." "I know what to think," said Griselda firmly. "If there's one thing I've learned in my life, it's that there's rarely smoke without fire. That young man didn't travel all the way from London in a fever to make false accusations. Something happened between him and Cedric Fortescue." "But murder?" protested Joyce. "Surely that's going too far. Even if Fortescue did behave badly 30 years ago, and I'm not saying he did, why would he want to kill the son now?" "Reputation," said Sir Edmund, who had just entered. He helped himself to bacon and eggs from the sideboard before continuing. "For a man like Fortescue, his public image is everything. He's due to receive a knighthood in the New Year's honours list, or so I heard. A scandal like this could ruin everything." Miss Marple noticed that Vanessa was absent from breakfast. She mentioned this to Mrs. Bantry, who looked concerned. I tapped on her door earlier, but she called out that she had a headache and would take a tray in her room. Poor girl, she's always been sensitive. I expect last night's drama upset her terribly. Naturally, Miss Marple murmured. Such a nervous disposition. I noticed it yesterday evening, even before our unexpected visitor arrived. She seemed quite tense during dinner. Did she? Mrs. Bantry looked surprised. I didn't notice anything particular. Oh, perhaps I was mistaken. At my age, one sometimes imagines things that aren't there, or notices things that others miss. Miss Marple smiled vaguely and turned her attention to her toast. Inspector Slack arrived at 9:30, a large red-faced man with an air of belligerent efficiency. He was accompanied by a young sergeant who produced a notebook and prepared to write down everything that was said. The inspector interviewed Michael Ashton first in the morning room with Dr. Haydock present. The young man was pale and weak but coherent, and he told his story with a desperate earnestness that was either utterly genuine or the product of remarkable acting ability. According to Michael, his mother had died of cancer in March, and on her deathbed had finally told him the truth about his parentage. His legal father, James Ashton, had been a kind man who had accepted Eleanor's pregnancy and raised Michael as his own son. But he had died when Michael was 12. Eleanor had struggled to make ends meet, working as a seamstress and taking in lodgers. She had never entirely recovered from the blow that Cedric Fortescue had dealt her, and the knowledge of the injustice had eaten away at her for years. I was angry, Michael said simply. Angry that he had gotten away with it, that he had gone on to fame and fortune while my mother had suffered in obscurity. So I wrote to him. I said I wanted what was owed to me. Not money particularly, though God knows we could have used it over the years, but acknowledgement. I wanted him to admit what he had done. And his response? Asked Inspector Slack. He didn't respond directly, but 3 days after I sent the letter, I started noticing that I was being followed. A man in a dark coat, always keeping his distance, but always there. I thought I was being paranoid at first, but then my flat was broken into. Nothing was taken, but everything was ransacked, as though someone was searching for something. Your letter to Fortescue, perhaps, suggested the inspector. I suppose so. I'd kept a copy, you see, and all my mother's old papers, letters, photographs, everything that proved the connection between them. After the break-in, I started carrying the most important documents with me. I didn't feel safe leaving them anywhere. And last night, Michael's face grew even paler. I'd decided to come down here. I found out Fortescue was staying at Greenways as a guest. I thought if I confronted him in person, in front of witnesses, he couldn't deny it. But as I was driving through the lanes, a car came up behind me very fast, with its lights blazing. It rammed me from behind twice. I lost control and went into the hedge. I managed to get out, but I could hear him coming after me. I ran toward the lights of the house. He closed his eyes. I don't remember much after that. The fever must have taken over. Inspector Slack made a non-committal sound. And these documents you mentioned, where are they now? Michael's eyes flew open in alarm. He reached instinctively for his jacket, which hung over the back of his chair, and began frantically searching the pockets. They were empty. They're gone, he whispered. All of them. The letters, the photographs, Mother's diary, everything. When did you last have them? In the car. I'm certain of it. They were in my inside jacket pocket when I crashed. Inspector Slack exchanged a glance with his sergeant. We'll need to examine the vehicle thoroughly. In the meantime, Mr. Ashton, I'd like you to remain available for further questioning. The inspector then proceeded to interview each of the guests individually. Most had little to contribute beyond their observations of the previous evening's dramatic events. Cedric Fortescue, when finally induced to leave his room, admitted to having known Eleanor Ashton, but flatly denied any wrongdoing, and dismissed the idea of hiring a murderer as absurd. "The boy is clearly unstable," he declared. "His mother filled his head with fantasies. I had a brief relationship with her years ago, yes, but it ended amicably. I had no idea she was pregnant, and if I had known, I would certainly have done more to help. As for these alleged threats and attacks, I know nothing about them. Presumably he invented them to add drama to his accusations." "And yet," said Inspector Slack heavily, "his car was indeed run off the road. We've examined it. Clear signs of having been struck from behind multiple times. The paint transfer suggests a dark-coloured vehicle, possibly black or dark blue." Fortescue spread his hands. "I don't own a car. I came down from London by train and was met at the station by Colonel Bantry. Ask him." This proved to be true. The inspector, looking frustrated, moved on to other lines of inquiry. But with each interview, the case seemed to become more, rather than less, mysterious. No one had seen any strange vehicles in the vicinity. No one admitted to having any previous connection to Michael Ashton. Everyone expressed shock and concern at the young man's condition and his allegations. Miss Marple, when her turn came, was characteristically helpful and characteristically vague. She described what she had seen and heard, mentioned that she had noticed some tension during dinner, but couldn't quite put her finger on what had caused it, and suggested that Inspector Slack would no doubt unravel the whole thing very quickly with his usual efficiency. The inspector, who had learned to be wary of Miss Marple's apparent ineffectuality, pressed her on several points, but she remained maddeningly imprecise. "I'm afraid my memory isn't what it was," she said apologetically, "and I'm not very good at that sort of thing, you know, crimes and mysteries. I much prefer to think about nice things, like the church bazaar and my garden." Inspector Slack departed at lunchtime, having learned a great deal and, as he irritably put it to his sergeant, having made no progress whatsoever. The case was clear enough. Michael Ashton had been attacked and had sought refuge at Greenways. But by whom? And where were the missing documents? And was there any truth to his allegations against Cedric Fortescue? After lunch, the guests began to disperse. The Wests announced their intention to return to London, as Raymond had work to do on his latest novel. The vicar and Griselda also prepared to depart, though Griselda did so with obvious reluctance, clearly feeling that she was missing out on further drama. Sir Edmund, however, insisted that both he and Vanessa would remain another night, as his daughter was still unwell, and he did not wish to distress her with travel. Miss Marple, when asked about her own plans, smiled gently and said she thought she might stay on as well, if dear Dolly didn't mind. "The excitement has quite worn me out," she explained. "I'd rather not attempt the walk home just yet." Mrs. Bantry assured her that she was more than welcome to stay as long as she liked, though privately she wondered what possible excitement Miss Marple could have experienced, sitting quietly in her chair and knitting through the entire affair. The afternoon passed quietly. Michael Ashton slept. Cedric Fortescue remained in his room. The remaining guests occupied themselves with reading or letter-writing, the easy chatter of the previous day entirely absent. Miss Marple asked if she might take a short walk in the garden, now that the weather had cleared. Mrs. Bantry offered to accompany her, but Miss Marple insisted that she preferred to go alone. "I find walking helps me think," she said, "and I have a great deal to think about at my age." She made her way slowly through the formal garden, pausing occasionally to examine a late-blooming rose or to watch a robin hunting for worms in the newly sodden earth. But her mind was not on gardening. She was thinking about faces at windows and missing documents and the curious way that Vanessa Harrow had gripped the curtain the night before. She was also thinking about something else, something that had struck her during breakfast, but which she had not yet fully formulated. It had to do with the timing of events, with who had been where and when, and with a small discrepancy that no one else seemed to have noticed. As she rounded the corner of the house, she nearly collided with Vanessa, who was standing in the shadow of an old yew tree, smoking a cigarette with quick, nervous movements. "Oh, I'm so sorry, my dear," Miss Marple said. I didn't see you there." Vanessa started violently, dropping her cigarette. "Miss Marple, I just needed some air." Of course. Such a trying time for all of us. Are you feeling better? Your father said you had a headache." "Yes, no, I don't know." Vanessa's composure, which had seemed so perfect at dinner, had completely crumbled. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her hands shook as she retrieved her cigarette case. "Miss Marple, can I ask you something?" "Certainly, my dear. Do you believe in justice? I mean real justice, not the legal kind, but moral justice." Miss Marple regarded her thoughtfully. "I believe that truth has a way of emerging eventually, though it may take time, and the path to it may be difficult. And if someone did something terrible years ago and got away with it, should they be allowed to go on living as though nothing had happened? That," said Miss Marple gently, "would depend very much on whether they had shown any remorse or made any attempt at restitution, and on what the consequences of exposure would be, not just for them, but for innocent parties who might be hurt by the revelation." Vanessa was silent for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "What if there are no innocent parties? What if everyone involved has been damaged in some way? Then I should think," Miss Marple said, "that adding more damage would not improve matters. But of course I'm just an old woman. I don't really understand these complicated modern situations. I dare say you young people know better than I do about such things." She smiled vaguely and wandered off toward the rose garden, leaving Vanessa staring after her with an expression of mingled hope and despair. Chapter 4. The Dinner Hour. Dinner that evening was a much more subdued affair than the previous night's gathering. With the Wests and the Clements departed, only 6 sat down to table. The Bantrys, Sir Edmund and Vanessa, Miss Marple and Cedric Fortescue, who had finally emerged from his room, looking haggard and considerably older than his years. Dr. Haydock had declined the invitation to dine, saying he preferred to take his evening meal with his patient. Michael Ashton was recovering well physically, the doctor reported, but remained agitated and convinced that his life was in danger. The conversation limped along, touching on safe, impersonal topics: the damage the storm had caused to the village, the upcoming harvest festival, the possibility of a hard winter. No one mentioned the events of the previous evening, though the subject hung over the table like a pall. It was during the fish course that Fortescue abruptly set down his fork and addressed the table at large. "I feel I owe you all an apology," he said. "My presence has brought discord to what should have been a pleasant social occasion. Colonel, Mrs. Bantry, I am deeply sorry. I think it would be best if I return to London tomorrow." "Now, see here, Fortescue," began the Colonel, but the actor held up his hand. "Please, I've done a great deal of thinking today about my life, about the choices I've made, and I've come to realize that perhaps there is some truth to what that young man said." A shocked silence greeted this announcement. Vanessa's water glass slipped from her fingers, splashing water across the tablecloth, but no one seemed to notice. I did know Eleanor Ashton, Fortescue continued, and yes, we had a relationship. She was very young, very innocent. When she told me she was pregnant, I panicked. I was on the verge of my first major role, you see. Everything I had worked for was within my grasp. The thought of being tied down, of having my career derailed before it had properly begun. He paused, looking down at his hands. I told myself I was being practical. I gave her money. I told her she could have the baby adopted, or marry someone else. I told her it would be better for everyone if we simply ended things cleanly. But I never thought about what it would mean for her, how she would feel. I was thinking only of myself. My dear fellow, said Sir Edmund uncomfortably, these things happen. You were young. You made a mistake. But I never tried to make amends, Fortescue said. I never even inquired about what had become of her. I simply went on with my life as though she had never existed. And now her son appears, angry and hurt, seeking some acknowledgement of the wrong that was done to his mother. And what do? I deny everything. I call him a liar and a madman. What kind of man does that make me? Miss Marple, who had been listening intently while appearing to focus on her soul, spoke for the first time. A frightened one, perhaps, Mr. Fortescue. Fear can make us behave in ways we later regret. Fortescue looked at her gratefully. You're very kind, Miss Marple. Kinder than I deserve. Tomorrow I shall speak to the young man, if he'll see me. I'll acknowledge the truth publicly if that's what he wants. The knighthood, my reputation, none of it matters any more. Not compared to doing what's right. Very noble, said Vanessa suddenly. Her voice was strange, tight with an emotion Miss Marple couldn't quite identify. But rather late, wouldn't you say? 30 years too late. Vanessa! Her father said sharply. No, she's quite right, Fortescue said wearily. It is too late. Far too late. But perhaps it's better than never. The rest of the meal passed in uncomfortable silence. When the ladies withdrew to the drawing-room, leaving the gentlemen to their port, Mrs. Bantry made a valiant effort to lighten the mood. But it was no use. Vanessa sat rigid and silent, her face pale and set. Miss Marple worked on her knitting, the needles clicking steadily. I think I'll go up early, Vanessa said abruptly. I still have that headache. Please make my excuses to father. After she had gone, Mrs. Bantry sighed heavily. Poor girl. She's been so unlike herself since yesterday evening. I do hope she's not coming down with something. The young are often more sensitive to atmospheric disturbances than we realize, Miss Marple observed mildly, both meteorological and emotional. When the gentlemen rejoined them, Colonel Bantry suggested a rubber of bridge, but no one seemed enthusiastic. The party broke up early, everyone retreating to their rooms by 9:30. Miss Marple prepared for bed, but did not immediately retire. Instead, she sat by her window, watching the moonlight play across the garden below. The night was clear and cold after the storm, and she could see quite distinctly all the way to the lane beyond the gates. She was not at all surprised when, shortly after 11 o'clock, she saw a figure emerge from the house and move swiftly across the lawn towards the yew trees. Even in the uncertain light, she recognized the purposeful stride. She watched until the figure disappeared into the shadows, then rose and drew on her warm dressing gown. Moving as quietly as her old bones would allow, Miss Marple made her way down the back stairs to the garden door. It was unlocked as she had expected. She slipped outside into the sharp autumn air and followed the path the earlier figure had taken. She found Vanessa, Harrow exactly where she expected to find her, standing beside the ruined car that had been towed up from the lane and left in the old coach house until the police could examine it more thoroughly. Vanessa had a torch and was searching through the vehicle with desperate intensity. I'm afraid they're not there." "My dear," Miss Marple said gently. Vanessa spun around, the torch beam catching Miss Marple full in the face before jerking away. "What are you doing here?" "The same thing you are, I expect. Looking for the truth. Though you're looking for evidence, while I'm looking for understanding." Miss Marple moved closer, her voice warm with sympathy. "You were looking for the documents, weren't you? The ones Michael Ashton said were stolen from him." Vanessa's defiance crumbled. She sank down onto an old wooden bench, the torch falling from her nerveless fingers. "How did you know?" "I didn't know exactly, but I suspected. You see, I've been thinking a great deal about what happened last night, about the timing of things. Michael Ashton arrived at approximately 8:15, just as we were finishing coffee. He had been running through the storm, yet when he burst in, his jacket pocket, the inside pocket where he said he kept the documents, was still buttoned. That suggested to me that he had been aware enough, even in his distress, to try to protect what he was carrying. So if the person who attacked him had taken the documents then, he would have had to unbutton the jacket, remove them, and rebutton it. In a storm, while chasing a man, it seemed unlikely, which suggested that the documents were taken later, after Michael had reached safety. But when and by whom? Miss Marple sat down beside Vanessa on the bench. Dr. Haydock examined him in the drawing room, with all of us present. Then he was taken upstairs to a guest room. The doctor stayed with him through the night. When would anyone have had the opportunity to search his clothing? There were a few minutes, Vanessa said dully, when Dr. Haydock went downstairs to fetch more bandages from his bag. Michael was unconscious. The room was empty. And you were one of the people who went upstairs to help prepare the room, weren't you? You and Griselda Clement. I remember now. Mrs. Bantry asked you to take up extra blankets. Vanessa said nothing. But here's what puzzled me, Miss Marple continued. If you had taken the documents then, you would surely have destroyed them by now. Yet here you are, searching the car where Michael said he had them last, which suggests to me that you didn't take them. Someone else did. Vanessa looked up, her eyes filled with tears. I wanted to. God help me, I wanted to. I went into the room while he was alone, and I saw his jacket hanging over the chair. I could see the edge of papers sticking out of the pocket. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't steal from someone who was ill and helpless, no matter how much I wanted those documents to disappear. Because of what they would reveal about Cedric Fortescue. Because of what they would reveal about my mother. Miss Marple went very still. "Ah," she said softly, "I wondered if it might be something like that." Vanessa drew a shuddering breath. My mother was Eleanor Ashton's understudy in the production of The Second Mrs. Tanqueray. They were friends, Eleanor and my mother. They shared lodgings, confided in each other. Eleanor told my mother everything about her relationship with Cedric Fortescue, about the baby, about his cruelty in abandoning her. And your mother? Fell desperately in love with him herself. She saw Eleanor's distress as her opportunity. She told Fortescue things about Eleanor, lies mostly, about Eleanor being unstable, about her threatening to expose him to the newspapers, about her planning to ruin his career. She made him paranoid and afraid, and then she offered herself as a solution. She would help him manage Eleanor, keep her quiet, make sure the scandal was contained. All she wanted in return was his attention, his affection. Miss Marple waited patiently. The story was emerging now, as such stories always did, like poison from a wound. Fortescue used her, of course. He never loved her. He let her think there might be something between them, let her do his dirty work for him. My mother was the one who pressured Eleanor to accept the money and leave London. She was the one who spread rumours about Eleanor being difficult and unreliable, ensuring she would never work in theatre again. and when it was all over, and Eleanor was gone, Fortescue cast my mother aside just as he had cast Eleanor aside. She never told you this herself. No, she died when I was 12 of a heart condition, but she kept diaries hidden away in her things. I found them when I was 17, when Father and I were sorting through her belongings after we moved. I read them all, every word. The things she'd done, the lies she'd told, the way she'd betrayed her friend. All for a man who never cared for her at all. It destroyed something in me, Miss Marple. The image I had of my mother, of who she was, it all crumbled. And that's why you reacted so strongly to Michael Ashton's arrival. Vanessa nodded. When he said his mother was Eleanor Ashton, when he started making his accusations, I knew that if he had proof, letters, documents, diaries, my mother's name would be in them. The things she had done would come out. Father would learn the truth. Everyone would know what kind of woman she really was. She looked at Miss Marple desperately. I know I should want the truth to come out. I know Fortescue deserves to be exposed. But my father loved my mother so much. She was the light of his life. If he knew what she'd really been like, it would break his heart. Miss Marple finished gently. Yes. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Miss Marple said, But you didn't take the documents. So who did? I don't know. That's why I'm searching the car. I thought perhaps Michael was confused about where he'd put them, that maybe they'd fallen out in the crash. But they're not here. Someone took them. Someone who wanted them to disappear as much as I did. Someone who had even more to lose than you, Miss Marple murmured. Yes, I'm beginning to see now. Oh dear! How very tragic! What do you mean? But Miss Marple was already rising, moving with surprising speed for a woman of her age. Oh, come, my dear. We must get back to the house. Quickly now. I very much fear that we may already be too late. What do you mean? But Miss Marple was already rising, moving with surprising speed for a woman of her age. Come, my dear, we must get back to the house. Quickly now. I very much fear that we may already be too late. Chapter 5. A Death in the Night. They hurried back across the lawn, Vanessa supporting Miss Marple's arm as the elderly lady moved as swiftly as she dared over the uneven ground. As they reached the garden door, they heard voices raised in alarm from within the house. Upstairs, Miss Marple said urgently. The guest room where Michael Ashton is staying. They found a small crowd gathered on the landing outside the room. Colonel Bantry stood in his dressing gown, looking shaken. Dr. Haydock was kneeling beside something on the floor just inside the doorway. Sir Edmund was there too, having been roused by the commotion, and from inside the room came the sound of someone being violently sick. "What's happened?" demanded Vanessa. Dr. Haydock looked up, his face grim. Cedric Fortescue. Dead, poisoned by the look of it. Miss Marple moved forward, and the doctor, knowing her capabilities better than to protest, allowed her to see. Fortescue lay sprawled just inside the doorway of Michael Ashton's room, his face contorted in agony, his hands clutched to his stomach. Beside him on the floor was a shattered cup and saucer. "What was he doing here?" asked the colonel. "I can answer that," said Michael Ashton weakly from the bed. He was sitting up, looking pale but alert. He came to apologize. He knocked on the door about half an hour ago. Dr. Haydock had gone down to the library to fetch a book. I couldn't sleep and asked if there was something I might read. Mr. Fortescue said he wanted to talk to me, to explain, to make amends. I told him to come in. "Go on," said Dr. Haydock. He was very agitated, very emotional. He paced around the room, talking about my mother, about what he'd done to her. He said he wanted to acknowledge me as his son, that he'd change his will, make proper provision for me. He was almost crying. Then he said he needed a drink of water, that his throat was dry. He went to pour himself some from the pitcher on the nightstand, but his hands were shaking so badly that he spilled it. I told him I'd already drunk from that pitcher and was fine, that it wasn't poisoned. Michael's voice broke. I said it as a joke, Miss Marple, just trying to lighten the mood. But he looked at me so strangely, and then he said, "No, not for you, for me." And he drank the whole cup down in one go. He knew it was poisoned. Sir Edmund looked bewildered. Then it was suicide. No, said Miss Marple firmly. It was murder. But the poison was not meant for Mr. Fortescue. It was meant for Michael. A horrified silence greeted this pronouncement. But that's impossible, protested Colonel Bantry. Who would want to poison young Ashton? And how could anyone have gotten poison into the water pitcher? This room has been locked except when Dr. Haydock was here, and he's been with the patient almost constantly. Not quite constantly, Miss Marple said. Dr. Haydock, when did you last leave Michael alone? The doctor frowned, thinking. I stepped out briefly around 10 o'clock to have a word with Mrs. Bantry about dietary requirements for tomorrow's meals. I was gone perhaps 10 minutes, and then again just now, to fetch the book. Another 10 minutes or so. And the water pitcher? When was it filled? Mrs. Bantry's housemaid brought it up around 9:30. Fresh water and a clean glass. I saw her bring it myself. And it was untampered with then? Must have been. I drank a glass myself around 10:15. I was perfectly fine. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So the poison was introduced sometime between 10:15 and 11 o'clock, during one of the periods when Michael was alone, or when you were out of the room. But why? Sir Edmund demanded. Why would anyone want to kill the boy? Because of what he knows, Miss Marple said simply. Because of the documents he carried, which prove not only Cedric Fortescue's guilt, but someone else's as well. Someone who had access to this room, who knew the layout of the house, who could move about freely without arousing suspicion. She turned to look at the assembled group. Someone who was becoming increasingly desperate as they realized that Michael's presence threatened to expose a secret they had kept hidden for 30 years. A secret that involved not just abandonment and betrayal, but something far worse. What are you saying? Dr. Haydock's voice was sharp. I'm saying that we've been looking at this case all wrong. We assumed that the attack on Michael in the lane was perpetrated by someone hired by Cedric Fortescue. But what if it was the other way around? What if Fortescue himself was in danger? And the real target was always Michael, because of what he might reveal. That's absurd, said Sir Edmund. The boy said he was being followed in London, that his flat was ransacked. That was before he even came to St. Mary Mead. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. And who knew he was coming here? He sent a letter to Fortescue 3 weeks ago. But letters can be intercepted, read by others. And once someone knew that Michael Ashton was preparing to expose Cedric Fortescue, they realized that their own secret might be exposed as well. What secret? Demanded the Colonel. Miss Marple looked at him sadly. The secret of Eleanor Ashton's death. Everyone stared at her. But Eleanor died of cancer, protested Dr. Haydock. 6 months ago, the boy said. That's what Michael believes, because that's what he was told. But I wonder if it's true. You see, I've been thinking about motives. Why would anyone go to such lengths, following Michael, ransacking his flat, trying to kill him, simply to prevent Cedric Fortescue's reputation from being tarnished? Fortescue's career is essentially over. He's already received the recognition he sought. The revelation of an old scandal might have been embarrassing, but hardly worth multiple murders. Then what? Sir Edmund looked confused. Unless the scandal wasn't just abandonment, but something darker. Unless Eleanor Ashton didn't die of natural causes 6 months ago. Unless she was murdered, and the person who killed her realized that Michael's investigation would eventually uncover that truth as well. Dr. Haydock had gone very pale. That's a serious allegation, Miss Marple. I know, and I could be quite wrong, but it would explain so much. The desperation to retrieve those documents. The attempt to kill Michael before he could speak to anyone at length. And finally, when that failed, the attempt to poison him here, in this house, where his death might be attributed to his injuries, or his fever, or even to suicide. But who? Colonel Bantry looked around at the small group. Who among us would have any reason to kill Eleanor Ashton? Miss Marple was silent for a long moment. Then she said quietly, I think we should ask Dr. Haydock that question. Everyone turned to look at the doctor, who had risen to his feet. His face was a mask of conflicting emotions, shock, fear, and something that might have been relief. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I think you do, Miss Marple said gently. You see, I've been watching you very carefully since last night. You've been under a terrible strain. When Michael first arrived and made his accusations about Fortescue, you became very quiet. You looked, if I may say so, not shocked but afraid. And later, during dinner tonight, when Fortescue began his confession, you looked positively ill. That proves nothing. No, it doesn't. But then there's the matter of your movements this evening. You were very quick to volunteer to stay with Michael, to remain with him through the night. At the time, I thought it was simply professional dedication. But now I wonder if you wanted to be close to him, to monitor what he might say, to prevent him from revealing something dangerous. This is ridiculous, Dr. Haydock said, but he had taken a step backward. And you had access to the water pitcher, Miss Marple continued relentlessly. You were in and out of the room. You could have introduced the poison at any time. You're a physician. You would know exactly what to use and how much. Why would I want to kill the boy? I'd never met him before last night. No, but you knew his mother. You knew Eleanor Ashton. The silence that followed was absolute. Dr. Haydock seemed to sag, his bluff, hearty manner deserting him entirely. How did you know? He whispered. I didn't, not for certain. But I remembered something. When Michael was delirious with fever, he called out for his mother. He said, I'm sorry, Mother. I tried, and you reacted. Only for a moment, but you flinched as though he'd struck you. Later, I wondered why that particular phrase should affect you so strongly. And then I began to think about Eleanor Ashton herself, about where she went after she left London, how she lived, how she died. Miss Marple's voice was infinitely sad. She came here, didn't she? To St. Mary Mead. Not to the village itself, but to one of the outlying cottages. She lived quietly, under her married name, Mrs. James Ashton. She raised her son, and at some point she met you. Dr. Haydock sank into a chair, his head in his hands. Yes, he said dully. She came here about 25 years ago. She needed a doctor for the boy, who was ill with measles. I treated him and I met her. She was still beautiful, still had that quality about her, that gentleness, that vulnerability. I fell in love with her, and she told you her story. Eventually, after we'd known each other for some time, she trusted me. She told me everything, about Fortescue, about the pregnancy, about the friend who had betrayed her. He looked up, his eyes haunted. I wanted to marry her. I proposed 6 times over the years, but she always refused. She said she could never trust anyone again, never give her heart away after what had been done to her. She said she was content as she was with her son, with her quiet life. But you weren't content. No, I loved her desperately, and I hated Cedric Fortescue with everything in me. He had ruined her life, destroyed her spirit, and yet he had gone on to fame and success, while she suffered in obscurity. It ate away at me, and 6 months ago, Dr. Haydog's voice broke. She was diagnosed with cancer, just as Michael believes. But it was early stage, treatable. She had every chance of recovery. I was treating her myself, administering her medications. And then one day, she told me that Michael had been asking questions about his father. She'd always told him that James Ashton was his real father, but he'd begun to suspect the truth. She said she was thinking of telling him everything, of finally unburdening herself of the secret she'd carried for so long. And you realized that if she did, Cedric Fortescue's name would come out. Yes, and I thought that if Fortescue knew, he might come forward, might try to make amends, might even, God help me, try to re-enter Eleanor's life. After all those years of loving her, of being faithful to her, even though she would never marry me, I couldn't bear the thought of Fortescue having any claim on her, even a moral one. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. So you killed her? I increased her medication, Dr. Haydog said in a voice barely above a whisper. Just a little at a time. Not enough to be suspicious, but enough to ensure that her condition deteriorated rapidly instead of improving. She died peacefully, or so everyone thought. Michael never suspected. No one did. But then Michael found his mother's papers, and he began his investigation. And you realized that if he pushed hard enough, if he demanded medical records, if he started asking questions about his mother's treatment, the truth might emerge. I panicked. I hired someone to follow him, to try to frighten him into dropping his investigation. When that didn't work, I tried to have him killed. And when he turned up here, alive, with those damned documents... Dr. Haydog looked up at Michael, who was staring at him with an expression of horror and disbelief. I'm sorry, boy. I'm so sorry. I loved her. You have to understand that. I loved her more than life itself. You killed her, Michael said, his voice shaking. You killed my mother. I was trying to protect her, to protect what we had, what you had. She didn't love you. She never loved you. I know. Dr. Haydog's face crumpled. I know that now. I've always known it, really. But I couldn't let her go. And I couldn't let Fortescue. He broke off, looking at the body on the floor. He drank the poison meant for you. He knew somehow. At the end, he knew what I'd done, and he sacrificed himself. A better end than he deserved, perhaps. Better than I deserve. Colonel Bantry had moved to block the door. I'll telephone the police, he said grimly. No need, said Dr. Haydog. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small vial. I came prepared in case things went wrong. In case I was discovered. I won't hang for what I've done. I won't give them that satisfaction. Doctor, no! Miss Marple started forward, but Dr. Haydog was too quick. He uncapped the vial and drank its contents in one swift motion. He was dead before anyone could reach him. Chapter 6. The Confession Explained. Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham with commendable speed, summoned by Colonel Bantry's urgent telephone call. He found 2 bodies and a house full of shaken dinner guests, none of whom could quite believe what had transpired. The inspector listened to their accounts with growing incredulity, made copious notes, and finally turned to Miss Marple, who sat quietly in her chair by the drawing-room fire, looking older and more tired than anyone had ever seen her. Well, Miss Marple, he said grudgingly, it seems you've solved another one. Though how you worked it all out, I'm blowed if I know. Miss Marple smiled faintly. I'm not sure I did work it out, Inspector. Not entirely. I simply observed people and tried to understand what they were feeling, what they feared, what they might do under pressure. Human nature, you see, doesn't change much from person to person. We all have the same basic emotions, the same weaknesses. But how did you know it was Dr. Haydock specifically? I didn't, not with certainty. But there were several small things that troubled me. First, his reaction when Michael arrived. Most people showed surprise or curiosity, but Dr. Haydock showed fear. Then there was his insistence on staying with Michael through the night. At the time, I thought it was professional concern, but it seemed excessive for a patient who was not critically ill. She paused to sip the tea that Mrs. Bantry had pressed upon her. But the real clue was in his response to Michael's delirium. When Michael called out to his mother, Dr. Haydock reacted with such pain, such personal anguish. It suggested to me that his connection to Eleanor Ashton was far deeper than that of a casual acquaintance, or even a concerned physician. It suggested love, and love, Inspector, can drive people to terrible acts. "But what about the documents?" asked Sir Edmund. "The ones that were stolen from Michael's jacket. Did Dr. Haydock take those?" "Oh yes," Miss Marple said. "During the first evening, when Michael was brought upstairs, and everyone was in and out of the room, helping to prepare it. Dr. Haydock had multiple opportunities. He took the papers and, I imagine, destroyed them. They were his primary concern. Proof that might eventually lead someone to question Eleanor's death." Michael, who sat wrapped in blankets near the fire, spoke for the first time. "I still have copies," he said quietly. "Back in London in a safe deposit box. My mother's diary, the letters, photographs, everything. I wasn't foolish enough to bring the only copies with me." Inspector Slack looked relieved. "That's something at least. You'll need to provide those to us, Mr. Ashton, for the official investigation into your mother's death." "Of course." Michael stared into the fire. "I thought I was avenging her by exposing Fortescue, but the real monster was someone else entirely. Someone she trusted who pretended to care for her." His voice hardened. "I hope he rots in hell." "Michael," Miss Marple said gently, "Dr. Haydock did care for your mother. In his own twisted way, he loved her. That doesn't excuse what he did. Nothing could excuse that. But it does explain it. He was a man consumed by an obsessive love, who couldn't bear the thought of losing even the small place he had in her life. When he felt that place threatened, he acted in a way that seemed logical to him, though it was actually insane. You sound as though you feel sorry for him." "I feel sorry for everyone involved in this tragedy," Miss Marple said. "For your mother, who never recovered from the betrayal she suffered as a young woman. For Dr. Haydock, who let love become possession and then murder. For Mr. Fortescue, who spent his life running from a sin of his youth, and finally, too late, tried to make amends. Even for you, my dear boy, who came seeking justice and found only more pain." Vanessa, who had been sitting silently beside her father, suddenly spoke. "Miss Marple, you said that Dr. Haydock killed my mother too, that she was involved in betraying Eleanor. How did you know that?" Miss Marple looked at her with compassion. "My dear, I didn't say that Dr. Haydock killed your mother. I said that Eleanor's death was connected to a secret involving your mother. But your mother died long ago of natural causes. Her role in the tragedy was over years before Dr. Haydock committed his crimes. But you knew about her, about what she'd done, I suspected from your behavior. You were so tense whenever Eleanor Ashton was mentioned, so afraid of what Michael's documents might reveal. It suggested that you had something to hide, something connected to the case, but not directly part of the current crimes. Your reaction was that of someone protecting a loved one's reputation, not someone guilty of murder." Vanessa's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for understanding." Sir Edmund put his arm around his daughter. "What was it?" he asked quietly. "What did your mother do?" Vanessa looked at him helplessly, but Miss Marple intervened. "Sir Edmund, perhaps that's a conversation for another time in private. Some secrets once revealed cannot be unlearned. You must ask yourself whether you truly want to know, whether knowing would serve any purpose other than satisfying curiosity." The architect looked at Miss Marple for a long moment, then at his daughter's tear-stained face. "No," he said finally. "No, I don't need to know. Whatever it was, it's in the past. Your mother is gone, and nothing can change what happened. What matters is here and now, and the people we still have with us." He drew Vanessa closer, and she buried her face in his shoulder, crying quietly. Miss Marple nodded approval and returned her attention to her tea. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "Well, if we're quite finished with the philosophy, I need to get on with the practical matters. There'll be inquests for both Dr. Haydock and Mr. Fortescue, and I'll need formal statements from everyone. Mr. Ashton, you'll need to remain available for questioning, and we'll need to coordinate with the London police about the incidents there. I'll cooperate fully," Michael said. "I want my mother's death properly investigated. She deserves that much." "Indeed she does," said the inspector. He gathered his notebook and prepared to depart. A nasty business all around. Still, at least it's over now. But as Miss Marple watched him go, she reflected that it was never truly over. Not for the people whose lives had been touched by tragedy. Michael would carry the knowledge of his mother's murder for the rest of his life. Vanessa would always know what her mother had done. Sir Edmund would wonder about the secret his daughter kept. And she herself would remember the look on Dr. Haydock's face as he drank the poison. The look of a man who had destroyed everything he loved and finally understood the magnitude of his crime. No, it was never truly over. The ripples spread outward, touching lives in ways both seen and unseen for years to come. Chapter 7. Pieces of the Puzzle. The following morning dawned grey and cold, with a hint of frost on the grass. The house party that had begun so convivially 2 nights before had ended in death and revelation, and those guests who remained were eager to depart. Yet Inspector Slack had requested that everyone stay until midday, when he would return to collect the formal statements he required. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and found Mrs. Bantry already in the breakfast room, looking as though she hadn't slept. The 2 women sat together over tea, not speaking at first, simply taking comfort in companionable silence. "I keep thinking about it," Mrs. Bantry said finally. "Dr. Haydock. We've known him for years, Jane. He delivered our neighbour's baby just last month. He saved my husband's life when he had that bout of pneumonia 3 years ago. How could a man like that be a murderer?" "Because he was human," Miss Marple said simply. "And humans are capable of both great good and great evil, often existing side by side in the same person. Dr. Haydock spent most of his life helping people, healing them, easing their suffering, but there was one area where his judgment was fatally flawed: his love for Eleanor Ashton. It consumed him, distorted his thinking until he could justify even murder in its name." "But surely love shouldn't do that. Shouldn't love make us better, not worse? Love should, yes, but obsession disguised as love is something quite different. Dr. Haydock didn't truly love Eleanor. If he had, he would have wanted what was best for her, even if it meant letting her go. Instead, he wanted to possess her, to control her life and her choices. When he couldn't do that through persuasion, he did it through murder." Mrs. Bantry shuddered. And poor Mr. Fortescue. Whatever his sins, he didn't deserve to die like that. no, Miss Marple agreed, though there is a certain terrible poetry in it, don't you think? He spent 30 years running from the consequences of abandoning Eleanor Ashton. In the end, he died protecting her son from the man who had killed her. Perhaps in that final moment he found a measure of redemption. Do you think he knew that the water was poisoned? I think he suspected something was wrong. Remember, Michael had joked about the water being poisoned. That would have put the idea in Fortescue's mind. And he knew that someone had stolen Michael's documents, someone who was desperately afraid of what they contained. When he entered that room, he must have been thinking about danger, about who might want Michael dead. And when he felt the impulse to drink from that pitcher, perhaps it was instinct, perhaps it was a conscious choice to test his suspicion. We'll never know for certain. Raymond West appeared in the doorway, looking rumpled and concerned. Aunt Jane, how are you? I've been worried about you. This has been a terrible ordeal. I'm quite well, dear boy. A bit tired, perhaps, but otherwise unharmed. Though I confess I'll be glad to return to my own cottage and my own garden. I've had quite enough excitement for 1 week. Raymond poured himself coffee and joined them at the table. I still don't understand how you put it all together. The connection to Dr. Haydock, I mean. There was so little evidence. There was plenty of evidence if one knew how to read it. The difficulty with evidence, Raymond, is that it doesn't always come in the form we expect. We think of evidence as fingerprints and alibis and concrete facts. But the most telling evidence is often in human behavior, in the way people react to situations, in what they say and don't say, in the small inconsistencies that reveal the truth beneath the surface. Such as, Miss Marple considered for a moment. Dr. Haydock's reaction to Michael's arrival was the first real clue. Most people were shocked or curious or sympathetic, but Dr. Haydock looked afraid. Not afraid for Michael, you understand, but afraid of him. That suggested he had something to hide, something he feared Michael might reveal. But he'd never met Michael before, no, but he knew who Michael was, Eleanor Ashton's son, and he knew what Michael might know or might discover. You see, Dr. Haydock had committed what he thought was the perfect murder. Eleanor's death appeared entirely natural, the inevitable result of her cancer. No one suspected anything amiss. But when Michael began investigating his mother's past, began gathering documents and evidence about what had been done to her, Dr. Haydock realized there was a danger that someone might look more closely at Eleanor's death itself. Medical records might be examined. Questions might be asked. The timing of her deterioration might seem suspicious to someone who wasn't blinded by trust in their physician. So he tried to kill Michael before he could dig too deeply. Precisely, the attacks in London, the ransacking of Michael's flat, the attempt to run him off the road, all of it was designed to either frighten Michael into abandoning his investigation or to kill him before he could speak to anyone who might take his concerns seriously. Vanessa entered the breakfast room, pale but composed. She had clearly spent the night in tears, but she held herself with a dignity that Miss Marple found admirable. Sir Edmund followed close behind her, his hand protectively on her shoulder. "Good morning," Vanessa said quietly. "I hope we're not intruding." "Not at all, my dear," said Mrs. Bantry warmly. "Please sit down. Have some tea. You look as though you could use it." As they settled at the table, Michael Ashton appeared in the doorway. He looked haggard but determined, and when his eyes met Vanessa's, they both looked away quickly. An awkward silence descended on the room. It was Miss Marple who broke it, her voice gentle but firm. "Mr. Ashton, won't you join us? I think perhaps it's time for some plain speaking. We've had enough secrets and misunderstandings. Let's have truth for a change." Michael hesitated, then came in and took a seat as far from Vanessa as the table arrangement would allow. I'm not sure what there is to say. The man who killed my mother is dead. Fortescue is dead. Justice, such as it is, has been served, has it? Miss Marple asked. I wonder. You came here seeking acknowledgement of the wrong done to your mother. You wanted Cedric Fortescue to admit what he'd done, to take responsibility. In the end, he tried to do exactly that. Before he died, he confessed to abandoning your mother, to treating her cruelly. He expressed remorse. He offered to make amends. Does that count for nothing? Michael's jaw tightened. It's 30 years too late. Yes, it is. But is it better than never? Your mother spent her life carrying the burden of what had been done to her. She never received an apology, never heard Fortescue admit his wrong. You have. That may not seem like much, but it's something she never had. Perhaps you could accept it on her behalf. I don't know if I can. That's honest, at least. Miss Marple turned to Vanessa. And you, my dear, you spent the evening in agony, afraid that your mother's role in your mother's betrayal of Eleanor would be exposed. But now you know that Dr. Haydock's crimes had nothing to do with what your mother did all those years ago. Your mother made terrible choices, choices driven by jealousy and unrequited love. But she didn't kill anyone. She lived with the guilt of what she'd done, and perhaps that was punishment enough. Vanessa nodded, tears welling in her eyes again. I've spent years hating her for what she did, hating myself for being her daughter. But last night, when Father said he didn't need to know, that he still loved me regardless, I realized something. We're not responsible for our parents' sins. We can acknowledge them, we can regret them, but we don't have to carry them forever. A wise insight, Miss Marple said approvingly, and one that Mr. Ashton might benefit from considering as well. You are not your mother's victim, young man. You are your own person with your own life to live. Don't let what happened to her define you forever. Michael looked at her, then at Vanessa. Your mother hurt mine, he said quietly. She betrayed her, lied about her, helped destroy her life. I know, Vanessa said, and I'm sorry. Sorrier than I can say. If I could change it, I would, but I can't. All I can do is tell you that I understand your anger, and I don't blame you for hating me. I don't hate you, Michael said, surprising himself. I don't even know you. And you're right. You're not responsible for what your mother did any more than I'm responsible for what Fortescue did to mine. He paused. Perhaps Miss Marple is right. Perhaps we both need to let go of the past and find a way to move forward. That, said Miss Marple with satisfaction, is the first sensible thing anyone has said this morning. Sir Edmund, who had been listening quietly, spoke for the first time. Miss Marple, may I ask you something? Last night you told me I should consider whether I really wanted to know what my wife had done, that knowing might not serve any purpose. Was that just kindness, or do you genuinely believe that some truths are better left buried? Miss Marple set down her teacup carefully. That's a difficult question, Sir Edmund. I believe in truth. I've spent much of my life uncovering it, but I also believe in mercy, and in understanding the difference between truth that heals and truth that simply inflicts pain. Your wife is dead. Nothing you learn about her past can change that, or change the years you spent together, or change the love you shared. If you learned that she had done something terrible, it would only poison your memories of her without serving any constructive purpose. That seems to me to be truth for its own sake, rather than truth in service of justice or healing. So you think ignorance is bliss? I think, Miss Marple said carefully, that wisdom lies in knowing when to seek truth and when to accept mystery. Not everything needs to be known. Not every secret needs to be exposed. Sometimes love means protecting someone's memory, even when, especially when, They can no longer protect themselves. Sir Edmund nodded slowly. "Thank you. That helps." Colonel Bantry entered the breakfast room, followed by Inspector Slack. The inspector looked businesslike and official, a marked contrast to his uncertain demeanour of the previous evening. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen," he said briskly. "I've come to collect those statements I mentioned. And Mr. Ashton, I need to speak with you about the London incidents. We've been in contact with the Metropolitan Police, and they'll want a full account of everything that happened." "Of course," Michael said, rising. "I'm ready whenever you are." "Before you go," Miss Marple said, "there's one more thing I'd like to clarify. Inspector, have you determined what poison Dr. Haydock used?" "Strychnine, apparently. He had access to it in his medical practice, kept it for legitimate purposes. Nasty way to die. And Mr. Fortescue's death, there's no question that he died from the poison intended for Mr. Ashton? None at all. The residue in the cup confirms it. Dr. Haydock must have introduced the poison into the water pitcher during one of his absences from the room. Pure bad luck that Fortescue was the one who drank it." The inspector paused. "Or perhaps not luck at all. Your theory about Fortescue suspecting the water was poisoned. There might be something to that. In any case, it was clearly Haydock's doing, and Haydock is beyond justice now." "Justice," Miss Marple murmured. "Such a complicated word. We speak of it as though it were a simple thing. Punishment for wrongdoing, restitution for harm. But real justice is much more complex, isn't it? It involves understanding forgiveness, redemption, and sometimes it involves accepting that perfect justice is impossible in an imperfect world." "Philosophy is all very well, Miss Marple," said the inspector, not unkindly, "but I deal in facts and law. Dr. Haydock committed murder, and if he hadn't killed himself, he would have hanged for it. That's justice as I understand it. And you're quite right, of course. I'm just an old woman who thinks too much. Pay no attention to me." But as the inspector led Michael away to take his statement, Miss Marple caught Vanessa's eye and saw understanding there. Some forms of justice couldn't be measured in courtrooms and sentences. Some had to be worked out in the human heart, in the slow process of forgiveness and healing. Chapter 8. The Hidden Motive. After the formal statements had been taken, and Inspector Slack had departed with a promise to keep everyone informed of the investigation's progress, the remaining guests began to prepare for their own departures. The atmosphere in Greenways had changed irrevocably. What had been a scene of comfortable hospitality now felt oppressive, tainted by death and revelation. Miss Marple, however, seemed in no hurry to leave. She had settled herself in the morning room with her knitting, working away at the blue booty with steady concentration. Mrs. Bantry found her there around 11 o'clock and sank into a chair with a sigh. "Everyone's leaving," she said. "Sir Edmund and Vanessa are waiting for their car. Michael Ashton is being driven to the station by Parsons. By lunchtime it will be just us again. Arthur and I and this great empty house, and nothing but terrible memories to keep us company." "Memories fade," Miss Marple said comfortingly. "Give it time and this week will seem like a bad dream. You'll have other parties, other guests, and eventually Greenways will feel like home again." "I suppose so. But Jane, I still don't understand it all. Why did Dr. Haydock kill Eleanor Ashton? You said it was because he feared Fortescue might re-enter her life, but surely after 30 years that was unlikely." "You're quite right, it was unlikely, but obsessive love doesn't operate according to logic. Dr. Haydock had spent 25 years loving Eleanor, hoping she would eventually turn to him, that time would heal her wounds, and she would finally accept his proposal. When she told him she was thinking of revealing the truth about Michael's parentage, his mind immediately jumped to the worst possible scenario. He imagined Fortescue learning he had a son, coming to St. Mary Mead, sweeping Eleanor off her feet with apologies and belated remorse. It was irrational, but obsession often is. And so he killed her, rather than risk losing her to another man. In his twisted logic, I believe he thought he was preserving what they had. If Eleanor died believing he was her faithful friend and physician, then at least he would always hold that place in her memory. Whereas if Fortescue appeared and she turned her attention to him, even in anger, Dr. Haydock would lose even that small connection. So he chose to end her life while he still mattered to her, however peripherally. Mrs. Bantry shook her head in disbelief. It's monstrous, it is, but it's also profoundly sad. Dr. Haydock wasn't an evil man by nature. He was a good physician who helped countless people, but he couldn't master his own emotions, couldn't accept that love must be freely given, or it isn't love at all. So he destroyed the very thing he claimed to cherish. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Mrs. Bantry said, "What about the documents? The ones Dr. Haydock stole from Michael's jacket. Did he really destroy them? Almost certainly. They were his primary concern. As long as those documents existed, there was a chance someone might eventually question Eleanor's death. But with them gone, and with Michael himself dead, as Dr. Haydock intended, there would be no evidence, no one to make accusations. The case would simply fade away." "But Michael says he has copies in London." "Yes, which Dr. Haydock didn't know. If he had, perhaps he would have acted differently, or perhaps not. By the time Michael arrived at Greenways, Dr. Haydock was already too deeply committed to his course of action. He had tried to kill Michael 3 times. There was no going back." Vanessa appeared in the doorway, dressed for travel. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, I wanted to say goodbye, and to thank you." "There's nothing to thank me for, my dear," Mrs. Bantry said warmly. "I only wish your visit had been under happier circumstances." "You've been very kind." Vanessa turned to Miss Marple. "And you, Miss Marple, you understood. About my mother, about what I was afraid of. You could have exposed her actions, brought them to light, but you didn't. You gave me the choice of what to tell my father. That was a great gift." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Your mother made serious mistakes, but she paid for them with a lifetime of guilt and unhappiness. There's a difference between justice and cruelty, my dear. Exposing her now would have served no purpose except to cause pain. As I told your father, some truths are better left undisturbed. Still, I'm grateful, and I've learned something from all this. I've spent so long being ashamed of my mother, of what she did, that I forgot she was also a person who suffered. She never got what she wanted, Fortescue's love. She spent her whole life knowing she'd betrayed her friend for nothing. That's a harsh punishment, it is indeed. Perhaps now you can remember her more kindly, as a flawed human being rather than a monster." Vanessa nodded, blinking back tears. "I'll try. Goodbye, Miss Marple. I hope we meet again under better circumstances." After she had gone, Mrs. Bantry said, "You were very gentle with her." "She deserved gentleness. She's been carrying a terrible burden, and none of it was her doing. Besides, I liked her. She has integrity. When she thought about stealing those documents to protect her mother's memory, she couldn't go through with it. That shows real character. Michael Ashton was the next to come and say goodbye. He looked much improved from the night before, rested, clear-eyed, and somehow lighter, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "I wanted to thank you, Miss Marple," he said formally, "for everything, for solving the mystery of my mother's death, for helping me understand what really happened. I'm not sure I did much, Miss Marple demurred. The truth revealed itself as truth generally does, given time. You knew, though. Before anyone else, you knew that Dr. Haydock was the killer. How? Miss Marple considered the question. I'm not entirely sure I can explain it. It was a combination of many small observations. His fear when you arrived, his insistence on staying close to you, his reaction when you called out to your mother. But more than that, it was a feeling, an understanding that someone in that room loved your mother, and that love had turned to something dark and twisted. Will you tell me something honestly? Do you think my mother knew? That Dr. Haydock loved her, I mean? Oh yes, I'm quite certain she knew. A woman always knows when she's loved, Mr. Ashton. The question is whether she returned those feelings, and I suspect your mother did not. Dr. Haydock was a good friend, a trusted physician, but not the man who held her heart. That was still my father, Fortescue. Perhaps, or perhaps it was your legal father, James Ashton, the man who accepted her and loved her and raised you as his own. From what you've told me, he sounds like he was a very fine man. Michael smiled slightly. He was the best man I ever knew. I wish I'd understood that better while he was alive. I was so angry when I learned he wasn't my biological father, so focused on finding Fortescue and making him pay, that I forgot to be grateful for the father I actually had. It's not too late to honor his memory. No, you're right. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go back to London, take the documents to the police as they've requested, and then I'm going to put all of this behind me. Fortescue, Dr. Haydock, the whole sordid business. I'm going to live my life the way James Ashton would have wanted, honestly, kindly, and looking forward rather than back. That, said Miss Marple warmly, is the wisest decision you could make. Your mother would be very proud. After Michael had gone, Miss Marple sat quietly for some time, her knitting idle in her lap. Mrs. Bantry, watching her, said, "You look troubled, Jane. Is something still bothering you?" "Not bothering me precisely. I was just thinking about the peculiar way this case unfolded. We began with what seemed to be an attempted murder of Michael, with Cedric Fortescue as the obvious suspect. Then we discovered that Fortescue had been a victim too, poisoned by a man seeking to kill Michael, and underlying it all was the murder of Eleanor Ashton, which had seemed like a natural death. 3 crimes, really, all connected by threads of old betrayals and unrequited love. It's certainly more complex than most of the cases you've encountered. Yes, and yet at its heart, it's very simple. It's about what happens when people can't let go. Of love, of anger, of past injuries. Dr. Haydock couldn't let go of his love for Eleanor. Michael couldn't let go of his anger at Fortescue. Vanessa couldn't let go of her shame over her mother's actions. Everyone trapped in the past, unable to move forward. And yet you helped them move forward in the end. Miss Marple shook her head. I simply pointed out that they had a choice. We always have a choice, Dolly, between holding on to the past or releasing it, between letting old wounds define us or learning from them and moving on. The difficult part is recognizing that we have that choice, and then having the courage to make it. She resumed her knitting, the needles clicking rhythmically. Mrs. Bantry watched her for a moment, then said quietly, "You're a remarkable woman. Jane Marple, nonsense. I'm just an old busybody who notices things. Now, shall we have some lunch? All this excitement has given me quite an appetite." Chapter 9. The final pieces Inspector Slack returned to Greenways that afternoon with additional questions and some news. He found Miss Marple and the Bantrys taking tea in the drawing room, a scene of such determined normalcy that it might have been amusing under different circumstances. "Thought you'd want to know," he said. accepting a cup of tea from Mrs. Bantry. "We've completed the examination of Michael Ashton's vehicle. Found some interesting things, such as," asked Colonel Bantry, "paint transfer from the vehicle that struck him. Dark blue, matches a car registered to Dr. Haydock. We've located the vehicle in his garage. Damage to the front bumper consistent with ramming another car. Clear evidence that he was the one who tried to run young Ashton off the road." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "So Dr. Haydock followed Michael from London, tried to kill him on the road, and when that failed, followed him here on foot. But why not simply leave once Michael reached the safety of the house? Why compound his crimes?" "Desperation, I expect," said the inspector. "Once Michael was here, in a house full of witnesses, telling his story about being attacked. Dr. Haydock knew the investigation would intensify. The London police would get involved. Someone might connect him to Eleanor Ashton. His whole careful plan was unravelling. So he decided to poison Michael and make it look like suicide or an accident. Precisely. If Michael died here, feverish and disoriented, it could be attributed to complications from his injuries, or even to his own hand. A troubled young man driven to despair by his discoveries. Dr. Haydock was a physician. He understood how to make death look natural. What he didn't account for was Fortescue drinking the poisoned water. A miscalculation with tragic consequences, Miss Marple murmured. And yet, as I said before, there's a certain justice in it. Fortescue spent his life evading the consequences of his actions toward Eleanor. In the end, he died protecting her son. Perhaps that counts for something. Perhaps. Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. There's another thing. We've been in contact with Dr. Haydock's solicitor. Apparently, the doctor had recently changed his will, left everything to a charitable foundation supporting women who'd suffered domestic abuse or abandonment. The solicitor said Dr. Haydock was quite insistent about it, said he wanted to make amends for something, though he wouldn't say what. A silence greeted this revelation. Finally, Mrs. Bantry said softly, "So he had some conscience at least, some sense of guilt over what he'd done to Eleanor." "Guilt that came too late," said the Colonel gruffly. "The woman was dead by then." "True," agreed Miss Marple, "but it suggests that Dr. Haydock wasn't entirely without moral feeling. He knew he'd done wrong. He was trying, in some inadequate way, to balance the scales. Of course, no amount of charitable giving could bring Eleanor back, or undo the harm he'd done. But it shows he was capable of recognizing his sin, even if he wasn't capable of stopping himself from committing it." "Human nature is a complicated thing," observed the inspector, with unusual philosophical insight. "We're none of us all good or all bad, are we? Just muddling through, making mistakes, sometimes terrible ones, and trying to live with the consequences." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, "which is why we must be careful in our judgments. Not to excuse wrongdoing. Dr. Haydock was a murderer and must be understood as such. But to recognize that even murderers are human beings with the full complexity that implies." The inspector rose to leave. "Well, I'll be filing my final report this week. The coroner's inquests will be held next Monday. You'll all need to attend, I'm afraid, to give testimony. After that, this unfortunate business should be concluded." After he had gone, Colonel Bantry said, "Do you suppose it will ever really be concluded? For those most affected, I mean." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "That depends on what they choose to do with their experience. Michael Ashton can let it embitter him, or he can use it as motivation to live more fully, to honour both his mothers, Eleanor, and the woman who raised him. Vanessa can let her mother's sins burden her forever, or she can accept that she is not responsible for them and move forward. Even we. She gestured to encompass the three of them, must decide whether to let this week's events poison our memories of Greenways, or whether to remember it as a place where, ultimately, truth prevailed and justice was served. "When you put it like that," said Mrs. Bantry, "the choice seems obvious. It does, doesn't it? And yet many people struggle their whole lives with that very choice. They cling to grievances, to anger, to shame, as though these burdens somehow define them or prove their worth. Learning to let go is one of the hardest lessons life teaches us." "You seem to have learned it well," observed the Colonel. Miss Marple smiled. "I've had many years to practice, and many opportunities to observe the consequences of both holding on and letting go. The village, you see, is an excellent laboratory for studying human nature. Every passion, every crime, every virtue and vice, they all appear there in miniature. After 70-odd years of observation, one begins to see the patterns." "And yet each case still surprises you," said Mrs. Bantry shrewdly. "Oh yes, the patterns may be constant, but the variations are infinite. That's what makes people so endlessly fascinating. We're all the same and we're all unique. Both things are true at once." She picked up her knitting again, and the conversation turned to more mundane matters. The arrangements for the upcoming inquests, the repairs needed to the garden after the storm, the possibility of visitors for the Christmas season. The shadow of death and revelation still hung over Greenways, but it was beginning to lift, as such shadows always eventually do. Chapter 10. Justice and Mercy. The inquests were held the following Monday at the Much Benham Town Hall, a gloomy Victorian building that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who entered. Miss Marple attended, as did all the other guests from that fatal dinner party. The proceedings were formal and sombre, with the coroner carefully recording every detail of the two deaths. The verdict on Cedric Fortescue was straightforward: unlawful killing by person known, namely Dr. Augustus Haydock. The verdict on Dr. Haydock himself was suicide while of unsound mind, a legal formula that allowed for some measure of sympathy while acknowledging the gravity of his crimes. What surprised everyone was the coroner's additional statement regarding Eleanor Ashton. Based on Michael's testimony and the evidence provided by the documents he had retained, an investigation would be opened into her death. Dr. Haydock's personal and medical records would be examined, and if sufficient evidence was found, a belated inquest would be held. Michael sat through the proceedings with rigid composure, but when the coroner announced this decision, his shoulders sagged with what looked like relief. Afterward, in the corridor outside the hall, he approached Miss Marple. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything. My mother will finally have justice." "Your mother has something better than justice," Miss Marple replied gently. "She has a son who loved her enough to seek the truth, and who will honor her memory by living well. That's worth more than any legal verdict. I've been thinking about what you said, about my father, James Ashton, I mean. I'm going to write about him, about their life together. Not for publication, just for myself. I want to remember him properly, remember what he did for us." "That's a lovely idea, and perhaps someday you might write about your mother as well. Not about what was done to her, but about who she was. Her kindness, her strength, her resilience. She deserves to be remembered as a person, not just as a victim." Michael nodded slowly. "I will. And Miss Marple, I've decided to donate whatever compensation comes from Fortescue's estate to the foundation Dr. Haydock established. It seems fitting somehow. Taking money meant to make amends for one wrong, and using it to help others who've suffered similarly. That's very generous of you. It's what my mother would have wanted. She wasn't a vengeful person. She just wanted to be acknowledged, to have her pain recognized. Well, now it has been. The rest, the money, the scandal, the revenge, none of that matters anymore. As he walked away, Vanessa Harrow approached. She and Michael had been carefully avoiding each other throughout the proceedings, but now she stood uncertainly, as though wanting to speak, but not knowing what to say. "Mr. Ashton," she called quietly. He turned. "I just wanted to say, I hope you find peace. I hope we both do." Michael looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "I hope so too, Miss Harrow. I think perhaps we will." It was a small moment, barely noticed by the others filing out of the hall. But Miss Marple saw it and understood its significance. Forgiveness, or at least the beginning of it. The first tentative steps toward healing. She herself was approached by Inspector Slack, who looked unusually thoughtful. "A word, Miss Marple, if you don't mind." "Of course, Inspector. I've been thinking about what you said the other day, about justice being more complicated than just punishment. I'm not sure I entirely agree with you. The law is the law, and it must be upheld. But I take your point about understanding the human element. Dr. Haydock was a criminal, but he was also a man driven by emotions he couldn't control. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it does explain it. I'm glad you see that, Inspector. Understanding doesn't mean condoning, but it does mean recognizing that we're all capable of terrible things under the right, or rather, wrong circumstances. None of us is as far from darkness as we'd like to believe." "Cheerful thought," said the inspector dryly. "Still, I suppose it's true. We're all just human in the end, exactly so. Which is why we must be both just and merciful. Just in holding people accountable for their actions, but merciful in recognizing the complexity of human motivation and the possibility of redemption. Even for murderers?" Miss Marple considered this. "I believe in the possibility of redemption for everyone, Inspector. Whether any particular person achieves it is another matter entirely. Dr. Haydock never had the chance. He chose suicide rather than facing the consequences of his actions. But Cedric Fortescue, he at least tried at the end to do the right thing. Perhaps that counts for something in whatever judgment awaits us all." The inspector nodded slowly. "Well, I'll leave the theology to the vicar. I deal in earthly justice, and that's complicated enough. But I appreciate your perspective, Miss Marple. You've been helpful, as always." After he had gone, Miss Marple found herself alone in the corridor. The others had all departed. The Bantrys to Greenways, Michael and Vanessa to the train station, the various officials to their offices. For a moment, she simply stood there, feeling the weight of her years and the sadness of the case. So much pain, so much waste, 2 lives ended, several others damaged, and all of it stemming from a single act of selfishness and betrayal 30 years before. Cedric Fortescue's abandonment of Eleanor Ashton had set in motion a chain of events that had ended in multiple deaths. And yet, as she'd told the inspector, there was also hope in the story. Michael's determination to honor his parents' memory, Vanessa's struggle to break free from her mother's legacy, even Fortescue's final sacrifice, flawed and belated though it was. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, as she made her way out into the autumn sunshine, was indeed a complicated thing, capable of great cruelty and great kindness, often existing side by side in the same heart. The trick was to encourage the kindness and restrain the cruelty, to build societies and systems that brought out the best in people rather than the worst. But that was work for the young. She was old now and tired, and ready to return to her cottage and her garden, and the comfortable routines of village life. She had solved another mystery, seen justice done, and helped a few wounded souls find their way toward healing. That was enough for 1 week. As she walked slowly toward the bus stop, she thought about the blue baby's booty she was knitting, nearly finished now. It was for her great-niece's child, due in December. A new life coming into the world, innocent and hopeful. Perhaps that was the real answer to the darkness she'd witnessed. Not justice or punishment, but new beginnings, fresh starts, the endless human capacity to begin again. Chapter 11. Reflections at St. Mary Mead. A week later, Miss Marple sat in her own garden, enjoying the pale November sunshine, and working on the final rows of the booty. The garden was preparing for winter, the last of the roses fading, the borders cut back, everything settling into dormancy. But there was beauty in it still. The architectural bones of the plants, the play of light on frosted grass, the stark elegance of bare branches against a clear blue sky. She had returned to St. Mary Mead with relief, grateful to be back among familiar surroundings. The village had been full of gossip about the events at Greenways, of course. Mrs. Price Ridley had held forth at considerable length about the moral decay of society when physicians could turn out to be murderers. Miss Weatherby had been more sympathetic, expressing sorrow for poor Dr. Haydock, who had always been so kind. The vicar had preached a sermon on the dangers of obsessive love, which had been received with varying degrees of understanding by his congregation. But the gossip would die down eventually, as gossip always did. Other scandals would arise, other dramas would unfold, and the deaths at Greenways would fade into village lore. A terrible tragedy, certainly, but one that had been resolved and could now be safely relegated to the past. Miss Marple had received a letter from Michael Ashton that morning. He wrote that he was settling his mother's affairs and preparing to move forward with his life. He had decided to train as a teacher, he said, working with underprivileged children. It was what his father, James Ashton, had always wanted for him, and he felt it was a fitting way to honour both his parents' memories. There had also been a brief note from Vanessa Harrow, thanking Miss Marple again for her discretion and kindness. Vanessa wrote that she and her father had had a long conversation, not about the specifics of her mother's actions, but about forgiveness and the nature of love. It had brought them closer together, she said, and helped her begin to let go of the shame she'd carried for so long. Both letters had pleased Miss Marple immensely. They confirmed her belief that good could come from even the darkest circumstances, that people could learn and grow and change if given the opportunity. Jane, are you there?" Miss Marple looked up to see Mrs. Bantry hurrying up the garden path, looking flushed and slightly breathless. "My dear Dolly, whatever is the matter? You look quite agitated." Mrs. Bantry sank into the chair beside Miss Marple's. "I've just had the most extraordinary conversation with Colonel Melchett. You remember him, the Chief Constable? He came to call this morning, and he told me something quite astonishing. Oh dear, not another crime, I hope. No, nothing like that. It's about Dr. Haydock's estate. Apparently his solicitor has been going through his papers, and they found something. A sealed letter addressed to the Chief Constable, with instructions that it should be opened only after his death." Miss Marple set down her knitting, her full attention now on her friend. And what did the letter say? It was a complete confession, not just about Eleanor Ashton's murder, but about everything. The attacks on Michael in London, hiring someone to follow him, the attempt to run him off the road. Dr. Haydock laid it all out in meticulous detail. He even explained his reasoning, his motivations. Colonel Melchett said it was one of the most extraordinary documents he'd ever read. Part confession, part apologia, part love letter to a dead woman. "How very like Dr. Haydock," Miss Marple murmured. Even in death, he wanted to control the narrative, to explain himself on his own terms. There's more. He included copies of letters from Eleanor Ashton, letters she'd written to him over the years. They show quite clearly that she never encouraged his affections, that she tried repeatedly to maintain appropriate boundaries while still valuing him as a friend and physician. She was kind but firm. There was never any ambiguity. So his obsession was entirely one-sided, built on his own delusions rather than in any real hope of reciprocation. Exactly. Colonel Melchett said the letters are heartbreaking in their way. Eleanor comes across as a woman trying desperately to be kind without giving false hope, while Dr. Haydock clearly interpreted every kindness as a sign of deeper feeling. It's a perfect example of someone seeing only what they wanted to see. Miss Marple nodded slowly. It's a common enough phenomenon. We all do it to some degree. Interpret events in ways that confirm our existing beliefs and desires. But in Dr. Haydock's case, it became pathological. He built an entire fantasy on Eleanor's friendship. And when that fantasy was threatened, he committed murder rather than face reality. The letter also contained something else. Mrs. Bantry continued. An apology to Cedric Fortescue. Dr. Haydock wrote that he had always hated Fortescue for what he'd done to Eleanor, but that in poisoning him, even accidentally, he had become worse than Fortescue had ever been. He said that Fortescue's sin was abandonment and cowardice, but his own was murder, and that there was no equivalence between the two. A moment of moral clarity. At least, yes, and he asked that his entire estate, after the charitable foundation was funded, should be used to erect a memorial to Eleanor Ashton somewhere in St. Mary Mead. A bench in the churchyard, perhaps with a plaque acknowledging her as a woman of grace and resilience who overcame great hardship. He wanted her to be remembered not as a victim, but as a survivor. Miss Marple was silent for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. Then she said, "That's quite remarkable, actually. For all his terrible crimes, Dr. Haydock did love Eleanor in his own twisted way, and at the end, he wanted to honour her properly, to give her the recognition she never received in life. Do you think it excuses anything he did? No, nothing can excuse murder. But it does make him more comprehensible, more human. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who let love become obsession, who convinced himself that his desires were more important than Eleanor's autonomy, or even her life. It's a cautionary tale, really, about what happens when we love possessively rather than generously." Mrs. Bantry shuddered. "I keep thinking about how we never suspected him. He was always so kind, so reliable. He delivered our neighbour's baby. How could someone like that also be a murderer? Because people are complex, my dear. We contain multitudes, as the poet said. Dr. Haydock could be genuinely kind and helpful to his patients, while simultaneously planning murder. The two things aren't contradictory. They're simply different facets of the same complicated human being. That's what makes crime so difficult to predict and prevent. The person capable of great evil is often also capable of great good. That's a disturbing thought. It is, but it's also true, which is why we must always be vigilant, not just against obvious villains, but against the capacity for wrongdoing that exists in all of us. Given the right circumstances, the right pressures, the right temptations, who knows what any of us might be capable of? Mrs. Bantry looked at her friend with something like alarm. "Jane, surely you don't think that you or I might commit murder? Under normal circumstances, certainly not. But if someone we loved was threatened, if we faced a choice between their life and someone else's, if we were pushed to the absolute limit of what we could endure, I'd like to think we'd still make the right choice, but I can't be certain. None of us can. That's the uncomfortable truth about human nature." They sat in silence for a while, contemplating this sobering reality. Finally, Mrs. Bantry said, "Well, I suppose we must simply do our best to never find ourselves in such circumstances, and to recognize the warning signs in others, the obsessive behavior, the inability to accept rejection, the gradual erosion of moral boundaries." Exactly so, though even that isn't foolproof. Dr. Haydock hid his obsession well for 25 years. It was only when Michael threatened to expose everything that he broke and revealed his true nature. Do you think Eleanor ever suspected that Dr. Haydock might be dangerous, I mean? Miss Marple considered this carefully. "I don't know. The letters suggest she was aware of his feelings and tried to manage them carefully. But whether she ever thought him capable of murder? Probably not. Most of us don't think that way about people we know. We assume that murderers are strangers, outsiders, obviously deranged individuals. We don't expect them to be our friends and neighbors, our trusted physicians. But they often are. Yes, they often are. That's why I'm always telling people to pay attention to small signs, small inconsistencies. The person who loves too intensely. The one who can't accept no for an answer. The one whose emotions seem disproportionate to the situation. These aren't always signs of danger, but they can be. And it's worth being alert. Mrs. Bantry rose to leave. "Well, I'd better get back. Arthur will wonder where I've got to. But I wanted to tell you about the letter. I thought you'd find it interesting. I did, very much so. Thank you for sharing it, Dolly." After her friend had gone, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, but her mind was far away. She was thinking about Eleanor Ashton, a young woman whose life had been derailed by one man's selfishness and ended by another man's obsession. Eleanor had survived the first betrayal, had built a modest but decent life for herself and her son, but she hadn't survived the second. And yet, Miss Marple reflected, Eleanor's story didn't end with her death. She lived on in Michael, in his determination to honour her memory and live well. She would live on in the memorial Dr. Haydock had arranged, in the charitable foundation that would help other women in similar circumstances. And she lived on in the cautionary tale her death provided, a reminder that even the kindest, most professional demeanour could hide darkness beneath. Miss Marple finished the last stitch on the booty and held it up to examine her work. It was perfect, soft, warm, carefully made with love, a gift for a new life, untouched by the darkness and tragedy she had just witnessed. That was what one had to hold on to, she thought. The goodness that persisted despite evil, the love that endured despite betrayal, the new beginnings that followed endings. Human beings were capable of terrible things, yes, but they were also capable of redemption, of growth, of choosing better the next time. Michael Ashton had chosen better. He had chosen forgiveness over revenge, honour over bitterness, a constructive future over a destructive past. Vanessa Harrow had chosen to break free from her mother's legacy rather than be defined by it. Even Cedric Fortescue, at the very end, had chosen sacrifice over self-preservation. These small victories didn't erase the crimes that had been committed, but they did prove that crime didn't have to have the final word. Goodness could emerge from evil, light could follow darkness, and life in all its messy, complicated, tragic beauty, could go on. Miss Marple set the completed booty aside and picked up her second ball of yarn. Time to start on its mate. There was always more knitting to be done, more gifts to be made, more small acts of love and care to counter the darkness in the world. She settled back in her chair, her needles clicking rhythmically, and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Another mystery solved, another case closed, justice served and mercy extended. The world was perhaps no better than it had been before, but it was no worse either, and for an elderly spinster in a small English village, that was achievement enough. The afternoon sunlight slanted across the garden, gilding the bare branches and frost-touched grass. A robin appeared on the fence post, bright-eyed and alert, surveying its territory. From somewhere nearby came the sound of church bells, calling the faithful to evensong. Life went on. It always did. And that, Miss Marple thought as her needles flew, was perhaps the greatest mystery and the greatest comfort of all.